Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Dana, managing partner of Dana Whiting Law, and I'm joined by one of our rising star associate attorneys, Mrs. Hallie Tessendorf. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you.
Good to have you, Hallie. You're always nice to get on camera here and give us a little different perspective of things. And what I wanted to talk about today, Hallie, is some challenges in drafting an estate plan that I think that a lot of people don't give enough thought and consideration to. And you know as well as I do, when we talk about estate planning to a married couple, that there's really, three stages of time that are critical, right? Stage one, they're both alive. I think that's the easiest part to plan for. Stage two, one's deceased and one's alive. I think that's the most difficult to plan for. And then stage three is they're both deceased. And I think that's, not as easy as they're both alive, but I think you don't have some of the challenges when they're both gone. But this concept of one's alive and one's deceased, tell me, and no matter who the surviving spouse is, tell me some of the things that could happen to that surviving spouse that could impact some decisions on the estate plan. What things possibly could happen in that life?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of considerations. And one of the first might be, are they familiar with the financial assets that are in the trust? And so should they be the manager, the trustee of all of these assets? Or do we want to bring on some help, like a co-trustee, an independent fiduciary, or maybe a child, somebody else who can kind of create some support to them as they manage the trusts?
Yeah, how involved were they in the finances when both were alive?
Mm-hmm.
And, it doesn't matter whether it's a male or a female, whoever the survivor is. It's really a question who was involved and who wasn't. And, in my case, my wife, Nancy, she's an unbelievable wife and mother and grandmother, but the furthest thing from her mind would want to be to understand stocks and bonds and managing real estate and dealing with tax returns and trusts. And, she would be a classic example where she wouldn't want to be the sole trustee. She'd want that kind of help. Mm-hmm. What other considerations do you think we ought to give to this surviving spouse?
I think that it can be difficult if there are children from different marriages, from prior marriages and relationships that now have a parent who's deceased and a step parent who might be the trustee or the beneficiary. So we want to consider, are there ways that we can make sure that the kids are incorporated and the spouse is taken care of, because they've been, relying on this partnership for so long. We don't want them to feel like they're the bad guy here.
Yeah, you and I had a client in here earlier that had that exact fact pattern. Both spouses are alive now, but one spouse had a net worth up here and one spouse had a net worth down here. And you can see tremendous difference on who dies first and who's the survivor. And, we're suspecting that this spouse up here is probably going to die first because he's so much older. And he does have kids of a prior marriage, and he loves those kids and he wants to take care of them, but he has a wife that he loves and he wants to take care of her. And you remember when we first saw kind of a proposal for them to consider, they had it where both his kids from a prior and her as the surviving spouse, who's our client, who we represent, they're drinking from the same trust. I mean, talk to me about the problems that's going to create, where you have one common pot trust and you have a trustee that says, take care of the health, education, and benefit of my kids, and take care of the health, education, and benefit of my spouse. What kind of problems you see there?
Oh, I think that can cause a lot of issues.
Yeah.
I think that the spouse is always going to feel like every time they need something, they have to now let the kids know that they're needing something, and always kind of looking over their shoulder. And sometimes we've seen the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? It may end up being unbalanced, and the spouse just is.
Yeah. No, I think it's a huge mistake. There would be an example where you'd want to separate. I call them horse troughs, right? You want all the horses drinking from the same trough, and you want to have separate troughs and let the kids drink from this trough and she drinks from that trough. And so that would be good. What other challenges are you seeing?
I just think that there's kind of this consideration of maybe getting remarried and wanting to make sure that we're protecting the kids at some point down the road, that this doesn't all just end up going to a new spouse or some creditor out there. So we kind of want to consider creditor protection.
Yeah, and sometimes I think clients get this idea that remarriage is a horrible thing, and I completely disagree with that. My wife Nancy and I, we talk about it all the time. If one of us died, would you get remarried, and how would you feel about that? And our situations where Nancy's mom, her and her husband were married 60 plus years, and she dies first, and Nancy's dad remarries, and what a blessing that was. He's at 87 years old and he remarried. So I never want to give the impression that remarriage is the bad idea, but what would everybody be afraid of if he remarried, what he could do without proper planning?
That the original spouse, that his children are disinherited, that they might not get something when the wife passes.
And I always wonder, it's always, I'm always interested on family dynamics, especially when the estate plan comes in. And sometimes I had this discussion with my kids the other day, that problem being in an estate planning family. My two sons are also estate planners. My daughter works in estate planning, and we tend to talk about it way too much, even at holidays and stuff. But this conversation of remarriage came up, and the daughters, they have different beliefs than a son would have, right? Daughters, it's almost like if dad remarries, whether he waits 1 year or 5 years, are kind of a little bit ticked off. Where sons kind of understand dads are needier and need more help and lonelier and more tend to remarry. And that's one thing I wanted to point out that's different in estate planning. That's huge difference is this idea of who dies first and who's the survivor, to me, is quite different. I've always wanted to write a book on what I've noticed there, but these are my perceptions after 40 plus years in doing this. I think it's very likely in most scenarios the husband will remarry.
And just because they have a longer life expectancy, many of my clients are a surviving spouse and they're the wife. And they've actually had a big handle on the finances and other things, but they do tend to be able to decide to keep going and maybe not remarry. But I have seen clients who are men who do find that companionship. And so we want to just make sure that when we're thinking about planning, it's not a bad thing, but that we have that written in, that there are options and flexibilities and maybe protections in case that happens.
Well, and I think this issue you brought up earlier about, co-trustees, spouse dies, and let's say statistically the husband dies first and the surviving wife, a lot of times, she welcomes the idea of having a co-trustee. And I had somebody I was talking to yesterday from San Jose, California, where they have one daughter, and she was on the Zoom conference as well, and we were talking about this issue of co-trustee and they both kind of agreed that a co-trustee is a good idea for the survivor. The discussion then turned who should be the co-trustee, and the wife was very, very comfortable with the daughter being the co-trustee, and I was comfortable with the daughter and the wife being co-trustees. I could see my wife and my daughter, or any one of my daughters, being very comfortable. But the husband's over there squirming around a little bit, and I was probably squirming around a little bit because I would not want to be a co-trustee with my daughter. There again, I remarry, and no matter what, might be a little bit upset. Are you hearing me on that?
Yeah.
And so we actually talked about drafting the estate plan different ways. If the wife's the survivor, daughter's co-trustee. Mm-hmm. If husband's survivor, we get somebody independent, a professional trustee, a private fiduciary, something along those lines. Quite different, right?
Yeah.
Are there any other issues you want to bring up? I think you've done a nice job kind of pointing out these things, but what else have we overlooked that's kind of different between a husband and wife, depending on who's the survivor?
Well, I mean, just to keep on that theme, if somebody is a husband and the surviving spouse, we kind of want to look out and protect as well from somebody who might abuse them with all the casseroles that they drop off and try to get into the estate plan. And a lot of our planning can, really highlight the asset protection that a trust has for that surviving spouse. And we want to make sure we have that too.
Yeah, I like that, and it kind of goes to this issue of co-trustee. And I've said in my situation, I've got 5 wonderful kids, and they've just been great kids, and have provided me with great grandchildren. But at this point in time, I wouldn't know how they would treat Nancy if I died, and now Nancy's running the ship on her own. I always use the term, they might nip at her heels a little bit. Hey, help me borrow money, co-sign for a house, or help me with a car, and Dad would have done it, or this or that. And being a mother, it's very difficult to say no. And I think maybe a co-trustee gives them a little bit of cover to hide behind, a little more protection on there.
Yeah, they don't have to be the bad guy.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Hallie. It's very, very good and very educational. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.